Welcome to Influential Entrepreneurs, bringing you interviews with elite business leaders and experts, sharing tips and strategies for elevating your business to the next level. Here's your host, Mike Saunders.
Welcome to this episode of Influential Entrepreneurs. This is Mike Saunders, the Authority Positioning Coach, and today we have with us keynote speaker Douglas Kruger, who is the author of Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good: How to Identify, Debunk, Dismantle Dangerous Ideas. Douglas, welcome to the program.
Great pleasure to be with you, Mike.
So I'm looking forward to learning about your book. Give us a little bit of background on what it was in your career and your life that led you to write a book about political correctness.
Yes, absolutely. It's a topic that's been playing around in my mind for some time now. The genesis of this one for me was in writing a couple of books on personal wealth and discovering that there are two sets of answers to the problem of poverty. I've been fascinated by the idea of how families and individuals can escape these intergenerational cycles of poverty. And I've discovered that, on the one hand, folks are served this set of cosseting, politically correct, nice ideas about what might work. Then on the other side of the spectrum, there are the things that are economically sound, that actually work, but are harder to hear. And over the course of writing a few books of this that I think I became quite attuned to these differences between what I now call political correctness versus the truth. And in fact, that is essentially the heart and soul of the new book. I mean, it spans massive time periods. It gets quite philosophically deep. But if you had to boil the entire thing down to 4 words, it would be tell the truth instead. And that really is the heart and soul of the entire project. Then, having sort of established that idea, why it matters to humanity, the history of politically correct, progressive, and Marxist thinking, we then go hunting for the trends that are shaping the world and in many senses rocking the world today. And we ask, what on earth is going on? And try to explain, debunk, and dismantle.
You know, I want to dive into a few of these examples, but as you were giving that introduction, it makes me think about something I'm sure you cover in your book, which is how do you address political correctness from the right perspective and attitude? What I mean by that is sometimes people can talk about political issues that come across very caustic or very cold. And I know that you want to show empathy on both sides of the equation. So how do you cover that and address that in your book?
Yes, and Mike, that's a very good point. We actually spend a fair amount of time on the psychology of persuasion because of exactly what you've identified there. The reason that political correctness is so popular and so, in a sense, socially effective, it almost becomes this meme that sort of self-perpetuates itself, is because the language is coached in kindness. And I spend a great deal of time in the book unpacking the distinctions between how the ideas are expressed as kindness versus what they do in the real world. Taking one simple and dramatic example of this one, if you go back to the founding of the Soviet Union, all of the politically correct terminology that we're using today was used among the population then. In fact, the term politically correct comes to us from Soviet Russia from 1921. And all of the things that we hear today about inclusiveness and being sort of broadly accepting and helping the poor and promoting equality, all of that kind of parlance was used to usher in communism in Soviet Russia. So there is a massive chasm, in fact, of distinction between the kindly language used and the outcomes of the ideas. Now, I go into different scenarios in which I point out that in some instances, it actually is very effective to use caustic wit, to be sarcastic, to deride ideas. But in other scenarios, it is not, and you have to distinguish. I think to a large extent, we who oppose politically correct ideas, and particularly anyone who is troubled by the rise of the sort of resurgent Marxism and radical leftism, which is a bit of a strange thing to be occurring so late in our history, we tend to fail to own the kind words. So we are debating against an opponent who is in many ways masterful at positioning itself as kind, as inclusive, as caring. However, as the title of my book suggests, and as I prove chapter by chapter, the kindly ideas do more damage than good. They do much more harm than good. So we certainly have a shortfalling, and it's a technique that I try to teach and one that we need to learn, in terms of actually adopting and using the words that show our side ideologically to be the kinder option.
I really like that approach. And I see from your Amazon listing that your book is a debate guide or a how-to manual for those interested in attacking those harmful ideas head on. So I want to ask you to explain that, because I think some readers might think, I don't want a debate guide. I don't want to get into arguments, but I realize that you really just want this to be a handbook for how people should understand how to approach these issues.
Absolutely. And in fact, this book straddles those two worlds in a way that I think very few books do. I find that a lot of the books in the literature today that in any sense debunk politically correct or radical leftist ideas tend to focus on one thing only. For example, it might be Dr. Thomas Sowell, whom I greatly admire, looking at the economic side of things. Or it might be someone like Jonah Goldberg talking about the historical side of things. I try to do something of a holistic approach to the topic where I say, all right, all of these issues that we're seeing, these strange new ideas washing around the world, identity politics and intersectionality, BLM, all of these things that we're seeing as part of the stage today, are they all traceable back through history to a single common cause? And the further back you go, the more fascinating it becomes. And so the first part of the book is the history lesson, the philosophy lesson. And that is the rather deep, somewhat academic side of things. And it borders on being a philosophy book. However, part two goes, if I've won you over to the point of view that I'm establishing, and if you're game for the debate, where to from here? So a very quick overview of the first section of the book, which, as I say, is radically different to part two. The dawn of politically correct language really comes to us from two things that happened one after the other. The first is the philosophy of a man named Rousseau in France, and following on from that is essentially what he gave rise to, which was the French Revolution. So Rousseau is seen as, in fact, he is termed the father of modern liberalism today. And Rousseau introduced the idea of collectivism to Western philosophy. This was a very new idea. Prior to Rousseau, we used to think in terms of morally good or bad and morally right or wrong. Rousseau came along and did something very different. He perceived of himself as what he called a natural man. And he believed that the ideas of right and wrong, of good and bad, were oppressive to him. He wanted to live as a free spirit. Now, naturally, this led to him having several different children with several different women. And he felt that oppressed him too. So what he did, because he was in the public eye and wanted to be seen in many ways as a respectable intellectual, he conceived of this idea by which the collective should raise his children instead of their burdening him. And the mechanism by which the collective acts then, of course, becomes the government. Now, in his own time, Rousseau's children all went to institutions and all died young. And Rousseau was not present for the death of any of his children. So that just gives you this indication of the kind of character, the nature of thinking that is right at the genesis of this idea. This collectivism then becomes the French Revolution, which says, get rid of the king, get rid of the old order, get rid of Christianity. What we're going to do instead is a brotherhood of man. And it's this idea of collectivism as a political system. Now, that led instantly to the Reign of Terror. And that was what we might call the very first instance of the policing of political correctness. And it was absolutely severe. In essence, what it boiled down to was, if you don't think correctly, according to the politics of the day, off to the guillotine with you. Now, Mike, it just goes downhill from there, because Marx picks up on the philosophy of Rousseau and says, well, this is a genius idea. What we really need is a political system and an economic system underpinning it to take this idea of collectivism forward. So instead of what we might call the classical American ideal, and in fact the Western idea of the sanctity and inviolability of the individual, we now have this idea that the individual is expendable for the good of the masses. And in places like Russia and China, that then translates into the death by genocide and starvation of tens of millions of people. And for some strange reason, we seem to think it's a good idea and that we should keep perpetuating it in the West today. I think otherwise.
Yeah, that timeline history lesson is really interesting and really good to connect the dots. Makes me think of another question. So have you seen this before? where there might be a specific political issue or a specific issue. And on the outset, it seems like it's pretty accurate. But then when you dig in a little bit deeper, there seems to be another agenda that comes to light.
That is precisely how it works, Mike. And imagine this scenario. You walk into a store and you buy yourself a can of soup, and it's clearly labeled soup on the outside. You're delighted with your purchase, you open it up, and what are your sets of expectations? You expect that when you open it up, you will encounter a viscous substance with a nice spicy aroma, something that really resembles soup. Now, imagine this scenario. You walk into a store and you encounter a can of Kindly Government Program. And it says Kindly Government Program on the can. And you would expect that when you open it up and pour it over your population, what you're going to get is Kindly Government Program. But here's the kicker. You never receive what it says on the can. And here's a practical example from your own nation's history, and it's one of the biggest examples. In the United States in the previous century, Black rates of unemployment and of poverty were on a sharp decline for a period of some 30 to 40 years. In other words, the levels of prosperity were improving dramatically, even exponentially. Then Lyndon B. Johnson had an idea, and his administration decided to declare war on poverty. And immediately, the improvement ceased. It stopped dead in its tracks. Now, here's the problem. We tend to observe, and we fall for this over and over and over. We observe what it says on the can, but 4 years down the line, we do not test the outcome. And that is where it all falls apart. It is disproportionately easy for a politician to stand on a stage or stand before a camera behind a microphone and promise something that sounds kind. We very rarely go back in time and actually measure the outcome. And if we did, in most cases, we would be horrified. I find that if you trace a lot of these ideas backward, you will find at their genesis some form of Marxist thinking. This idea of collectivism by which we say, put the individual's needs aside for just a moment. It doesn't matter if they face some degree of discomfort, so long as it's for the greater good. And that tends to be the animating thought process behind it. But yes, we rarely get the soup that we're promised on the can.
So you say testing or measuring the outcome. To me, as a marketer, that seems obvious because you really want to have return on investment or ROI calculated. So, what's the return on this initiative, right? What do you do to recommend testing the outcome before you launch?
Well, absolutely. And all we have to work with is history. And for that reason, you find that from the politically correct side, history is under constant attack and constant revision. I think one of the most tragic things that I've seen, gazing from the outside into your nation, is a youth that have in many ways been taught to despise their own history. And this is such a new idea, and it is such a poisonous idea. If you went back even a few generations, and again, just looking at this from the outside, the perception was that America had such a healthy narrative. It was the light of the world and the symbol of freedom. It was founded on one of the most genius ideas that I think humanity has ever conceived of, which is that no tyrant may create a set of rules by which they give you rights. In contrast to what has been the norm all down the annals of human history, the United States was founded on the idea that the individual is inviolable and sacred before God. And then beneath that idea, and in no way impeding upon it, you may then build a nation. And the very fact that that concept is under such attack today is quite surprising to someone looking in from the outside. However, when you then start to look at the activism that has gone into making that happen, there is a clear history behind it. And it goes like this. Most of what you see today in terms of youth discord with the values of a classical United States come to us from a group called the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School have a great deal to answer for in terms of dismantling the values of Western Judeo-Christian society. They were an openly Marxist group who moved from Germany to the United States, and when they saw the failure of economic Marxism, they said, no worries, we will move to cultural Marxism and we will simply continue to attack the old order. They had a plan by which to infiltrate and to attack Western academia, and they were astonishingly, even breathtakingly effective at it. One of the advocates, one of the people who came out of this tradition was a man by the name of Howard Zinn. And this is the author of A People's History of the United States. And if you know anything whatsoever about how history is supposed to be reported, how genuine historians compare sources and try to give us a truthful account of what happened centuries ago, then you compare it to the way this man went about it, with the goal of trying to prove to Americans that everything about their nation was racist from its founding, and is, as in essence, it's a whole structure of shame. It's astonishing to see how effective people of this sort of ilk are, but it is done with a Marxist intent. And as I say, I think it's astonishing to see how effective it has been and how much of a grassroots movement it has become. To the extent that I may, as a commentator from the outside, I try to show how this has happened and how people can actually debunk it. So the quick answer to your question is history is precious. We can't test things going forward. We can't know the outcome of things going forward, but we can certainly see which things have happened in the past. It is entirely possible to determine how tyrannies have arisen before and how freedom is promoted. And unfortunately, much of political correctness today is working in the service of tyranny once again.
You know, I find it interesting in that example that the group of men moved here and said, hey, we can't achieve our goal economically, so let's attack the next best thing, academia. And I think that's so important that they selected that, because we as humans look up to people in positions of authority, intellectual authority, academic authority. So tell us a little bit more about that aspect and how we can be cautious and aware of these types of things.
Yes, and that is such a major point of focus of the book. In fact, we wash back and forth over what comes out of academia and how, in a sense, to protect the truth from academia. And what a tragic thing to have to say that one would have to do that. And in fact, the opening of the book, the first 4 sentences go like this. In the beginning, there was a bad idea. Sadly, no one squashed it. It invariably begins with a liberal professor in the university's Department of Sociology. Next, you hear it on the news. So that is the progression of these ideas. It always comes from very far left-leaning, Marxist-inspired university professors, and generally from the sociology department. I'll just give you a very practical example of the truth versus political correctness in the world of academia. Today, one of the big debate topics culturally is this idea that gender might be a social construct. And for many people today, we take this as a simply established truth that the science backs it up. Now, here's the science that actually backs it up. It comes from a man named John Money. I've traced this one backward. John Money was a professor who had this idea. He wanted to prove that a boy could be raised as a girl and vice versa, that your physical gender had nothing in common with your social gender. Now, he had a problem to overcome in the sense that how on earth do you actually test this hypothesis? And in a sense, he hit it lucky with someone's personal tragedy. What had happened in the United States at the time was that a young boy had had a botched circumcision, and his genitals had actually been burnt off. And what Money did was he approached these parents and he said, allow me to raise your boy as a girl, and let's see if we can prove this hypothesis. And this distraught family agreed to buy into this idea, and they thought this might be a good way forward. Now, this little boy had an older brother. And what Money did was he encouraged the two of them, and this is all historically documented, he encouraged the two of them to interact with one another in sexual role-playing manners. And I mean, here I pause and I ask, do you think there's a chance this man was evil? So here he has this juvenile older brother interacting with an infant younger brother dressed as a sister, and they are supposed to sexual role play. Now, the outcome of this entire thing is that both children committed suicide. Mm-hmm. That was the outcome of his experiment. But you would never know that by reading the academic papers about it, in which Money declared his experience a resounding success. His experiment, a resounding success. Now, what we have is every book that has been written in academia about this idea that gender might be a social construct is built on the science of John Money. And today we hear things like, well, doctors agree that this is true. You have to understand what people on the far left mean when they say doctors agree. They mean people who have a doctorate in the social sciences. They do not mean people who have any insight into human biology or evolutionary biology or anything of that nature. So what happens is you begin with a lie. You begin with a scientifically fraudulent case. Then the next person comes along and says, well, that's fantastic, and writes it into their textbook and affixes their PhD to it. And so it goes.
Yeah.
And this is what happens in academia. But so few people know it. They only see the outcome, which is consensus in a sociology department among somewhat arrogant professors who say, we know this to be true. They know no such thing.
You know, it reminds me of a couple things I want to try to articulate, see what you think. Have you ever heard the expression, so I've got 10 years experience in whatever the field is, but is it really true that they only have 1 year of experience 10 times over? You know, they've got that 1 year of experience, but they never go deeper. They never stay updated on learning and continuing their education. So in reality, they've got 1 year of experience 10 times over. So I think that that mindset there also leads to the thinking of people wanting to be spoon-fed. You know, they just want to be handed something. They don't want to earn it or learn or exert effort. And I know that here in the United States, for decades, it's been this way, where little kids in youth sports, they don't keep score. They don't have a winner or a loser. They literally just say, good job, you've participated. So I think in reality that, causes people to think, don't tell me anything wrong. Don't tell me where I lost. Don't tell me, where the other person was better. And that kind of leads into this equality aspect, right?
Spot on. And in fact, I think the best book title ever written on that topic is Equal is Unfair, which makes the point that if you try to level by social engineering, you must in some way discriminate against someone. And here's how I cover that in this particular book, is there is a history to this, and there is a reason why we think that way today, or why we are subjected to that kind of thinking today. And it originated with post-Darwin, philosophers across Europe and across the West experienced what they termed the death of God. Now we can return to that idea, because that begs the question, does science in fact indicate a death of God? And there is much to be said about that, and we say more in the book. However, take that as given. Atheism became part of the accepted intellectual tradition in the West. And that created this incredible crisis of meaning and of how to orient your societies. Philosophers like Nietzsche and Karl Marx picked up on this idea and said, well, essentially, if we're floating free in a vacuum and there is no moral good or bad, then how do you organize your societies? How do you conceive of law? And how do you know what needs to be done next? And the only answer that the secular atheist left has ever been able to come to is egalitarianism. And that seems like a self-evident idea, that in the absence of all possible or plausible values, the only thing that can remain and have any claim to being useful is the idea that everyone should be equal. Now that sounds wonderful. I mean, again, there's our kindness language coming through. However, there are several problems with this one. As economist Thomas Sowell points out, nothing in nature is egalitarian, for starters. I mean, quite aside from different communities having different desires, different aspirations and ambitions, if you even take one family, no two siblings are exactly the same in terms of their wants, desires, achievements, etc. So total equality does not exist anywhere naturally in nature. And that means, and here's where it goes wrong and becomes sinister, it means that you have to level people in order to make them equal. And that is where the danger creeps in. That is where we go from a kindly sounding idea to what I identify as the most murderous concept humanity has ever had. In the book, I actually perform a SWOT analysis for our species. And I ask the question, what are the most dangerous things for human beings? And the first answer to that one, surprisingly, is not actually a virus to come out of Wuhan. It is a small creature called the mosquito. Kills over 1 million of us every year. So in terms of living things, the mosquito is our most deadly adversary. But in terms of ideas, equality is the most deadly idea we have ever had. And just to put some perspective to that, most people, if you ask them, what is the most deadly idea we've ever had? They are very likely to default to the politically correct answer, religion. Religion has killed more of us than any other idea. And Mike, it is not even close to being accurate. If you take, just the number of human lives ended by an abortion clinic in the United States or across the United States, in the last 6 days, they have outperformed the Spanish Inquisition's total body count for 350 years.
Wow.
So that puts it in some kind of a context. However, the abortion industry cannot even come close to the idea of egalitarianism and equality, which has racked up a body count of some 120 million lives over the course of a single century. That way outperforms all religious slaughter.
So a count meaning what? How do you define that?
Death by genocide or death by starvation or death via war in the interests of. And all of that is originated with this idea that we're going to do this for the greater good. And you end up with these government genocides and death via starvation on a scale that outperforms anything else. So once again, we have this idea that sounds so kind. In the absence of a moral value system like the Judeo-Christian system, you would think that the self-evident moral system would be equality and egalitarianism. It's the most deadly idea we've ever had.
Well, I can tell that your book is really full of research and not just opinion. So I want to ask this final question, where you say you can have truth or you can have political correctness, but you can't have both. How can you say that?
All right. So what I do in the book is I go trend by trend and I go fad by fad, and we explore the ideas that we are sold as gospel truth, things that we are told are settled science. Then we compare them to what the science actually says or what the history of these academic ideas actually tends to be. And we realize that they have nothing in common. You mentioned earlier the sort of world of academia and how easy it is for people, even at PhD level, to simply and lazily regurgitate what they hear around them. One of the minds that I most admire, and he actually passed away just earlier this year, is the late Sir Roger Scruton, a British philosopher who was actually knighted for his services to humanity. And he makes out the point that most people start out, when they go into varsity level, on the far left and often very much enamored of Marxist ideas. And he says the intellectual development tends to start off as conservative among the family, then Marxist in your early academic stages. He says, however, if you spend any genuine critical time really examining these issues, examining the history, examining the claims, examining the philosophy and the science, you will end up back at a conservative perspective. However, that takes a great deal of work. And that's what I try to unpack in the book. Instead of the lazy, politically correct answers, which people simply parrot, let's go searching for the truth.
So Douglas, I love your approach and how you lay out for people just the way to see things right from the beginning, to identify and debunk and dismantle these kinds of opinions. So let's wrap up with this. What's the best way that someone could reach out and connect with you and pick up a copy of your book?
Absolutely. I'm attempting to build a bit of shall we say, a fighting philosophical community around this idea that you can have truth or political correctness, but you can't have both. So I've launched a website called Breaking Woke, breakingwoke.com. And on the site, I aggregate all of the YouTube videos in which I speak about these issues, help you to debunk terrible ideas and so forth. And it gives a bit of an overview of the book as well. In terms of actually getting your hands on the book, I have a strange one. I'm hoping they'll send one to me in Johannesburg, because the paperback copies, of course, will be in stores across the United States. But I think for global audiences, and this is intended for a global reading audience, the easiest way is either to go to Amazon.com and get either the ebook or the paperback, or to give it a couple of weeks, and then the audiobook will be available globally as well. And that is read by the dulcet tones of the original author.
You've been listening to Influential Entrepreneurs with Mike Saunders. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show or listen to past episodes, visit www.influentialentrepreneursradio.com.